Greetings, YouTubers. I wanted to speak with you today about the inconsistency of parallelomania. I've been reading through a book lately which compiles excerpts from ancient literature that was written that was originally written in the approximate time and place of the Old Testament. The most famous of these extra-biblical materials would be the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Law Code of Hammurabi. So they're not part of the Bible, but they are in a similar socio-cultural context. And one of the things that is immediately obvious to me as I've been reading through this book is how different these pagan texts are from the Bible. Now there are parallels between them. In both the Noah and the Utnapishtim flood stories, for example, the ark or the boat comes to rest atop a mountain. The hero, Noah or Utnapishtim, then sends out birds to see when it is dry enough to leave the ship. Now these parallels do seem to be more than a coincidence. It would seem that since the Utnapishtim story long predates the writing of Genesis, the biblical author or authors of the book of Genesis were in some way, shape, or form basing the story of Noah, or at least the telling of the story of Noah, upon the story of Utnapishtim. At the same time, though, there are also major differences between the two flood accounts, and similarly for the other ancient Near Eastern parallels. The Law of Moses and the Law of Hammurabi, for example. The one account is radically monotheistic in Genesis, while the other is from a humanistic polytheism standpoint. That would be one example of the major differences. Persons antagonistic to biblical faith have sometimes taken this data, that there are parallels between the pagan and the biblical accounts, to argue something like the following. 1. There are pagan stories which parallel biblical stories. 2. The pagan stories are presumably either ahistorical or, at best, very unreliable history. We therefore rightly reject the pagan stories. 3. But, since the biblical stories are analogous to the pagan ones, we must reject them, the biblical stories, as well. 4. So we conclude the Bible is historically unreliable. That argument on the part of the skeptics is, I think, overstating the case. As I've already said, though there are some significant parallels at the superficial level, the differences between the biblical and pagan accounts outweigh their similarities. The differences are more significant than the similarities. We need to remember that just because A is analogous to B in one sense does not mean that A is analogous to B in every sense, or in some other sense. If they're analogous in one way, they're not necessarily analogous in another way. It is illegitimate to focus in on a few of the let me start that sentence over. It is illegitimate to focus in on a few minor parallels while ignoring the legion radical differences. Okay, so that's the first argument that I wanted to consider, that the parallelomaniacs will urge against Christianity or the Bible. So set that argument, that first argument, on the back burner, and we'll now turn to a different argument, a second argument, that critics of the Bible sometimes posit against it. This second argument is related to the so-called synoptic problem. All four Gospels in the New Testament are similar to each other. The first three Gospels are very similar to each other. Sometimes the synoptic Gospels, the very similar ones will have the same Jesus stories in the same order, told with the same or close to the same words. That is a fact. It is a fact which has led most people who consider the question to conclude that Mark was written first and that Matthew and Luke were based, at least in part, upon Mark. So you've got Q and Mark, and then Matthew and Luke use Q and Mark, and they also use independent sources, M and L, they're usually called. But Mark first, Matthew and Luke based on Mark. Now, though the Synoptic Gospels, and to a lesser extent the Gospel of John, are quite similar to each other, they are not completely identical in all respects. Luke is not a photocopy of Matthew. And some people don't seem to like this dissimilarity. Because Mark has a different emphasis than John, so goes the argument, both Gospels are called into question. Or perhaps Matthew may appear at first blush to flat out contradict what John wrote. In that case, we can't trust either one of them, either Matthew or John, to tell us anything substantive about what actually happened way back when surrounding the ministry of Jesus. That's the second argument that some parallelomaniacs will sometimes use to undermine confidence in the Bible. Like the first argument, the case for the second argument is, I think, overstated. But never mind that for now. The main point of what I'm getting at in this video is not why each of these skeptical arguments fail when taken in isolation. Rather, I wanted to call your attention to the fact that they cannot both be urged at the same time by the same skeptic. Why? Because in the first argument, everything is built up around the shallow similarities between the different accounts. The major differences are conveniently swept under the rug. However, in the second argument, just the opposite problem occurs. The four Gospels are virtually identical in a lot of ways. It is the superficial differences that are honed in on by the critic, while the radical agreement is completely ignored. Which is it going to be? In every case, there are minor and major similarities as well as minor and major differences when we're comparing two texts. To reach an accurate conclusion, all data must be borne in mind. We must keep in mind the minor similarities, the minor differences, the major similarities, and the major differences. We can accept only the data we like when it helps our case, and then ignore data of the very same kind when it hurts our case. This observation that I'm making does not necessarily apply to any specific critic. If either the first or the second skeptical argument is used in isolation from the other, this problem of inconsistency would not arise. Still, both arguments are common enough, and mayhaps you, if you are a skeptic, have used each of them on different occasions. If so, I hope you now see how this to adhere to both arguments is logically fallacious. Even if either argument works on its own, they can't both be right. So that is the inconsistency that I wanted to point your attention to that can occur in the writings and teachings and thinking and speech of parallelomaniacs that are hostile to biblical truth claims. Thank you for watching. Please comment, especially if you disagree with me. I want to have an intelligent discussion about this if you are so inclined. So again, thank you, and shalom out.